Welcome back to the second half of the France 24 debate. Today marks the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration, a British pledge that many feel paved the way for the creation of the State of Israel. Now, in 1917, Britain's then Foreign Minister Arthur Balfour sent a letter to Lord Rothschild, the leader of the British Jewish community at the time, promising to help create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Well, to this day, that declaration remains hugely divisive. It's seen as a betrayal by Palestinians, but celebrated by Israel. France 24's Shirley Sitbourne explains what exactly the Balfour Declaration is and explores how the British government's strategy affected the region.
In the early 20th century, hundreds of thousands of Arabs live in Palestine and the Ottoman Empire, and also a minority of Jews. A growing minority fleeing persecutions mainly in Russia and Poland. They believe Palestine, or Zion for them, is the best option for their future. Those Zionists convinced the British government to back their initiative. That's the Balfour Declaration.
Of course it was a founding document because it was maybe the first time that a very prominent politician expressed his solidarity. And it paved the way to other decisions that eventually materialized in Israel having its independence.
The British government didn't just have the Jews' interests at heart. It wanted to have free access to the Suez Canal. The UK also hoped Jews would convince world powers to join British troops fighting World War I.
Jews represented some kind of vast international power, and that Jews could persuade President Woodrow Wilson in America to join the war.
The British also promised Arab leaders to create an independent Arab kingdom across the Middle East, while telling the French they will get a big chunk of that land too. Conflicting promises that worsened the animosity between Arabs and Jews.
It's not legal. With which right then they deliver our country to another identity, political identity.
The Balfour Declaration doesn't deny the Palestinians' right to statehood. In fact, it calls for the protection of non-Jewish communities. The current British government says this means the Palestinians too should have their country, and only then would the declaration be fully applied.
Well, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration will be marked by celebrations and protests. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will dine alongside Britain's Theresa May in London tonight as part of celebrations. Protests, meanwhile, are expected in the UK, while in the West Bank, Gaza and East Jerusalem, thousands of Palestinians have called on the British government to apologise for the Balfour Declaration. Well, today in the France 24 debate, I'm joined by Mark Otte, who's Director General at the Royal Institute of International Relations. He's also the former EU Special Representative to the Middle East peace process. That was in 2003 to 2011. Very good to have you, Mr. Otte. I'm joined equally by Chris Doyle. He's Director of CABU. That's the Council for Arab and British Understanding. Good evening to you, Mr. Doyle. Well, we heard We heard from you, from the report rather, that the Palestinian ambassador, when he said that the British had created chaos across the world. Your thoughts on that, Mr. Doyle?
The Balfour Declaration, the 100th anniversary, this is one of the most contentious anniversaries throughout the Middle East, because for Palestinians and indeed Arabs, they see this as a great betrayal of the pledges and promises that were made by Britain at the time, that would have seen an independent Arab state. And really, for the last 100 years, this has been a millstone, an anchor around the British government's neck. If you take it together as well with the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the way in which the Middle East was carved up 100 years ago into various areas of mandates or colonies, in such a way that really denied not just the rights of the Palestinians, but also Arabs elsewhere. So there's a huge awareness of what this 67-word declaration of support for a Jewish national home in Palestine meant for the Palestinians. For them, it is the start of a journey that has been extremely painful, that's led to 70% of their population becoming refugees. And today still, we have almost 5 million living under occupation. of course, for the Jewish people, for the Zionist movement, this was a huge step forward. And it's understandable why they celebrate, because this was definitely a major step towards establishing the State of Israel in 1948.
So a momentous occasion, Mr. Doll, a momentous occasion for Israel, but as you say, it's seen as a betrayal by Palestinians. If I come to you, Mr. Rote, to what extent can the Balfour Declaration be blamed, if you will, for triggering many years later the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
There's a lot of history to be studied and so on. We have the Balfour Declaration, we have the Sykes-Picot Agreement, we have a lot of things that have happened during the 20th century to this region. I think what is important to consider now is not that to reverse history, but to see where we go, how we go forward, how the injustice was done to both the Jewish people and the Palestinian people can be redressed in a way that doesn't look at the narrative of the past, but at a conscious project to look at the future.
With such a contentious issue, though, if we look forward to what you say, how do we go about amending then such a contentious debate?
Well, I think, okay, we are where we are. There is an Israeli state that has been recognized by the international community. There is a peace deal that was signed with the Oslo Agreement that eventually must lead to a two-state solution. That would be to recognize the rights of the Palestinians to their own country and territory, and at the same time to take into account the changing strategic circumstances in the region.
But the Oslo Accord until now has stalled. I mean, nothing has really advanced since that was signed.
I agree. So what is the promising avenue right now is the fact that the Palestinian factions, the Fatah, Hamas, and other groups, have agreed for national reconciliation. I think in order to have a meaningful negotiation between Israel and the Palestinians, this is the priority now. And I think this is one of the most interesting developments in the last few years in terms of the possibility of having essentially two national movements, one state and another that has not been created yet, to have a discussion about how to live together. A
discussion's needed, you say. If we head back to our colleague Chris Doyle in London, I mean, let's go back to this Balfour Declaration. The actual wording has puzzled Mr. Doyle, historians, for many years now. 67-word letter, some saying he never mentioned a state, he mentioned more of a homeland. What do you make of that? Is that what's caused some of the issue?
Well, it's interesting, actually, that Boris Johnson, the British Foreign Secretary, in his book on Churchill, described the Balfour Declaration as an exquisite piece of Foreign Office fudgerama. And that is, in a sense, what it is, because it didn't say a Jewish state, it said a Jewish national home in Palestine. It didn't also promise, for example, Palestinian or Arab political rights. It talked about the non-Jewish population in Palestine and their civil and religious rights. So the Balfour Declaration wasn't a very crystal clear document, and it was designed in many ways to blur the lines in so many ways, and that's created a lot of frictions down the line. But I totally agree with Mark Otte. I mean, we have to deal where we are at the moment. I very much would like to have seen the British government actually using the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration to express, I think, greater support for the creation of an independent, viable, sovereign Palestinian state. I think that is the way forward. I think what many of us are concerned about is that the current Israeli government, and indeed to an extent backed by the new Trump White House, really sees this as an opportunity to make sure that there never can be that independent, viable, sovereign Palestinian state. We're seeing a huge surge in settlement numbers, these settlements that break up the contiguity of a potential Palestinian state, and even recently, very dangerous proposals backed by the Israeli coalition government that would see huge settlement blocks annexed to Jerusalem, and indeed Palestinian communities actively excluded from Jerusalem. Now, if we are going to have a successful peace process, and it cannot come quickly enough, we need to address this now. And I think it does mean to send very strong messages to all parties that it's time to get round the negotiating table on a serious basis to end this conflict once and for all.
Mr. Doyle, as you speak there, we're looking at pictures of Theresa May, and she's obviously meeting with her Israeli counterpart, Benjamin Netanyahu, in London today. They're set to dine a little later on. What Theresa May has come out and said today is that she's proud of, or indeed the UK is proud of, a pioneering role in the UK, which was played by the UK, played in the creation of Israel. She's also said that she is for a sovereign Palestinian state. 100 years on from when the letter was written, the Balfour Declaration, are we any closer? Are we any closer in terms of language being more solid to moving towards a double-state solution?
I don't think we are, to be honest. I think that the government's been forced in the last few days to acknowledge a little bit more the Palestinian narrative. We've seen that in an article by Boris Johnson this week, and also in the chamber of the House of Commons. Theresa May, the Prime Minister, for over a year now, has been talking about celebrating the anniversary of the Balfour Declaration with pride and respect. Now, that's all very well, but how this is seen elsewhere in the Arab world amongst Palestinians is that Britain is officially celebrating the loss of their homeland. That's how they see it. And I'm not sure they achieved the requisite diplomatic balance to try to keep a modicum of balance between all the sides. So, unfortunately, I suspect that there was nothing that the British government could have done to really navigate the tightrope of these competing narratives. But we pay lip service to the notion of a two-state solution at the moment. We do issue pro forma condemnations of settlement building and so forth. But I think that many people now believe that unless more serious, proactive action is taken, it's very hard to see that this Israeli government is going to really change the way it conducts its policy on the ground, and that's where it really counts.
Mr. Otter, your response to that, are we paying lip service to a two-state solution?
I think at the moment I would agree that we're paying lip service, and that the reality is that formal declarations, council conclusions when it comes to the EU will not advance the process. There was a time where, together with the Americans and the other members of the quartet, we were actually moving towards building a Palestinian state from the bottom up under Prime Minister Fayyad, and it was working. We created, including with a lot of UK support, a Palestinian security service, a police. I was moved today to see pictures from the Rafah crossing, where actually the EU was instrumental to open the Rafah crossing under international supervision, a deal that I negotiated after Prime Minister Sharon decided to evacuate Gaza. This was to be followed by other ways to facilitate movement of Palestinians between Gaza and the West Bank, between their territories and Israel, between their territories and the rest of the world. This has been lost. This momentum has been lost, and it's pity. Now, it's very important what Egypt did in terms of pushing the Palestinians to national reconciliation. There are two things to that. The first thing is that for a long time, the external powers did everything they could to undermine Arab nationalism and Arab national movements. Like Israel encouraged the rise of Hamas, to counter and to undermine the PLO, which was the Palestinian National Movement. So that's one thing. Again, it's the past. Let's forget about the past. Let's look at what is happening now. If there is a chance for unity among Palestinians, it will give them much more legitimacy and much more power in the vis-à-vis the international community to negotiate a deal with Israel. And this deal with Israel is what the parties will decide that they want to make about it. And I think it's not only about territorial issues, it's about justice, it's about recognizing the harm done to the other parties. It's about recognizing the fate of millions of Palestinian refugees. This is something we have to deal with in Europe too after World War II. Now, and the second thing is that I think it's not a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's an Israeli-Arab conflict. And the Arab nations have to do something also to reassure.
Do you think, Mr. Doyle, if I bring you back in on this, do you think that more unified Palestinian factions, which we saw on Wednesday, I believe, began to happen, do you think that's the way forward in terms of opening dialogue with Israel?
Unquestionably, I think that this reconciliation deal certainly holds out the prospect of making some progress, but we need to build on this fast. I cannot emphasize the state of the humanitarian crisis within Gaza at the moment. It is really appalling. Barely any electricity, barely any power. The water is unfit for human consumption. And there was a huge surge of hope and expectation when the Palestinian ministers came into Gaza from Ramallah and hope that this would change their ordeal. Now, time is short here because the population in Gaza is beginning to feel as if they've been shortchanged because there's still an electricity, a power crisis. And unless this is addressed, this deal, unfortunately, could fall by the wayside. There are, of course, all sorts of political obstacles to sort out. There's not much trust between Fatah and Hamas. That's certainly true. There are the issues of Hamas militias and will they eventually be disarmed. It's very hard to see how that will happen. But somehow we need to get behind this deal because having one single Palestinian political address is essential. It does make the possibility of viable peace negotiations down the line possible. And it also makes possible the saving, really, of Gaza. It's in a complete disaster zone right now. And unless it's opened up, unless the economy is reinflated, then extremism actually will flourish. And this has been a disastrous policy all round over the last 10 years. And it's vital because Gaza and the West Bank are the two components of the Palestinian state that should come into being. And it's a long way from that at this moment.
OK, Chris Doyle, you're the director of CABU, the Council for Arab-British Understanding. I was also joined by Mark Orte, the former EU Special Representative to the Middle East peace process between 2003 and 2011. That brings us to the end of the debate. Thank you very much for your time. Time now for Media Watch. Emma James joins us in the studio. Good to have you. We've been speaking with our two guests there during the debate about the anniversary, the 100th anniversary of the Balfour Declaration. That's been reflected online, and it's the street artist Banksy that's really caught people's attention, Emma.
Yes, absolutely. A lot of people talking about Banksy's work because, well, for many, this is a cause for celebration. For others, it is a cause for anger. This kind of reaction that we're seeing on Twitter is fairly typical of those people who don't want to see this recognised. Sorry, but what's to celebrate about an imperial power thinking it has the right to give someone else's land away, says this Twitter user. This particular account has been set up really to talk about all things to do with Balfour. And certainly there are plenty of accounts out there paying tribute to the role that it played in sort of world development, if you like. And they are quoting Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, who has said, "We are proud of the role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary with pride." Now, her reaction is very, very different to what we have seen from the renowned street artist Banksy, more known really for works of graffiti. But what he's created today is an apology party, really. It's modelled on the old-fashioned UK street parties that we used to see, sort of, especially after the Second World War, but we've seen some more recently, anniversaries of the coronation, things like that. And this is an apology party where somebody dressed as the Queen actually unveiled an etching in a wall saying just sorry. And the idea is that this is apologising for all of the trouble that has been caused. The statement from Banksy says the British didn't handle things well here. When you organise a wedding, it is best to make sure the bride isn't married. Now, what I should point out is that this party was actually held in Bethlehem at the wall that divides Israel and Palestine. It is an area where certainly Banksy has been working for quite some time. This isn't some political movement that he's just happened across right now. Now, the work itself was carried out by a professional stone carver. Funnily enough, he's actually worked on Buckingham Palace, the Queen's own residence. And some very much agree with what Banksy has had to say here. The destruction of Palestine should be a cause for shame, not celebration, says this person. Banksy has always stood by the Palestinian people. In fact, it was over a decade ago when he first daubed that wall with his first bit of graffiti. So that's been going on for quite some time. And since then, he's created the Walled-Off Hotel, not the Waldorf Hotel, Walled-Off Hotel. You can see it pictured here a little closer, right next to that wall in Bethlehem. It opened earlier on this year. It's got a gift shop. It sells artworks, some of them Palestinian artists, it's worth noting. There's also a museum there, which is designed really to inform people of more about the history of the place, the history of the conflict between the two sides. And so he does take his interest in Palestine very seriously. I think that it's safe to say. However, despite that, there is some discord in Palestine itself. Some people not happy with what he's done, some not happy with the hotel, others not happy with the party that he arranged to mark this Balfour centenary. As The Guardian reports, there were certain Palestinians who actually crashed the party, as it were, because they felt it was wrong that he was using Palestinian children as a centrepiece to this party. They came from a local refugee camp, and they feel basically that his voice has turned out to eclipse those of genuine Palestinians, and all the while it's also adding to his own personal brand, and so they feel that perhaps that is inappropriate. So yes, they were unhappy about the use of children. Other people reacting to this on Twitter, though, totally get the criticism of Banksy for overshadowing Palestinian voices, but this is kinda awesome, says Sam Houston. And final word on the story, Wayne Tarquin Smith, I'm assuming he's British with a name like that, whoever Banksy is, because of course he is renowned for retaining his anonymity. There have been various claims as to who he is, but nobody knows for definite. Whoever he really is, they are doing more to inform people than mainstream media will ever do. I hope that he's not lumping Frans van Kat into that category.
I'm sure he isn't, Emma. Thank you very much for our roundup of what the media is saying. All right, we're going to take a short break. We'll be back with plenty more news for you. Delano D'Souza here is next. Stay tuned. You're watching France 24.